Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, probably the second one for the 30th of August 2024, considering I scheduled one for the middle of the night. Thank you for tuning in to finding out what has happened in the Ukraine war over the last 24 hours in terms of losses and statistics and whatnot. We are going straight to where we normally start, Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply, and you can find the caveats in the description to the video below. 1,200 personnel lost is a fairly substantial number, as it seems to be every day of this war. 3 tanks, another low number there. 23 troop carrying AFVs is above average now. 23 artillery systems is above average, but actually a low number for that category. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, depends what that is as to how valuable that loss might be. 57 vehicles and fuel tanks and 2 pieces of special equipment. So some lower numbers. I think this is going to be reflective of a slowdown across the front lines in all places other than, I think, Pokrovsk, and that includes Toretsk and New York. I think also Vuhledar area is going to be right down at the bottom of the Donetsk front line, and I think Kursk up into Russia. So those 3 areas are basically where it's all happening. Everywhere else will be a good deal quieter, and I think that will therefore signify a lower loss in a number of categories, but I could be wrong. That's just my speculation. Now, if we're talking about, well, actually, before we go on to that, an example might be, and to be fair, I'm seeing fewer of these. So the kind of typical attack videos where you see a Russian attack of maybe 5 vehicles or 3 vehicles or 6 vehicles attacking and then driving to mines, getting blown up, getting repelled. I'm seeing far fewer of those videos at the moment. So that's completely anecdotal, but it kind of goes towards this idea that there are fewer tanks getting destroyed and infantry fighting vehicles, although there's an uptick today. There have been lower numbers over the course of the last week or so. Here we see 13 out of 17 armoured vehicles being destroyed by FPV drones and anti-tank guided missiles. So this was a large-scale mechanised assault in the Kurakova direction. So that's right down the south, sort of on the way to the Vuhledar area, towards Kurakova, which is westwards there. This is a big attack, and the Ukrainians have done a lot of damage with this. The 46th Air Mobile Assault Brigade there, repelling that attack. But this is one bit of video where normally I would be trying to choose which one to reference between, one of maybe 6 different videos of things getting destroyed. So I think there is an intuitive sense, as far as I'm concerned, that the activity has dropped across many areas of the front line, even if in certain areas it is incredibly intense. Okay, then let's look at the losses, and the losses are large for both sides. If we look at combat losses, it's about 1-to-1, give or take, maybe a few more for the Russians and the Ukrainian, not really much in. Oh no, sorry, a few more for the Ukrainians and the Russians, because that's actually truck losses there. Sorry, my bad. So the Ukrainians losing a few more, and that's going to be as a result of work up in Kursk. But the fact that the Russians are losing fewer combat assets is one of 2 things, like I always say. It's either that they are attacking less, like I was just talking about, or a combination of both, or that they are using other types of vehicles to attack rather than these armored vehicles and tanks. So if we look on the Russian list, we might see Desert Cross 1000-3 motorcycle. Actually, not too many today. So at the max, probably 3 other vehicles used in attacks. So yeah, then I would probably think that they're just attacking less on the front lines. But the Ukrainians losing quite a few pieces themselves. These are MRAP and APC and IFV heavy, which would signify that they are attacking or moving troops a lot and losing vehicles in that kind of way, which is exactly what you'd expect. You'd expect them to be using far more of these kind of MRAP vehicles in Kursk than other types of vehicle. Anyway, the Ukrainians have lost couple of bits of artillery, a few tanks there, nothing too significant. Bradley's been abandoned and then hit by a drone drop bomb. BMP M80A, haven't seen that before, so that's a destroyed one there. The APCs are Novator, that's the Ukrainian indigenously made APC, if I remember correctly. Humvee damaged. Max Pro captured, it's an American Max Pro there. Kozak is their own indigenously made one. Cougar H, Kuopi, Max Pro, Max Pro, Max Pro. So almost all of the MRAPs are, well, all of the MRAPs and mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles are either Western provided or possibly made themselves. It's interesting, so no Soviet equipment there. Same for the APCs, 50% for the IFVs, and for the tanks, a couple of older tanks there. So, yeah, part of the course, what we've been talking about, how they are replacing, or they're either replacing the Soviet combat asset losses with Western ones because they've cycled through their old equipment, or they're using the best stuff rather than using their older Soviet equipment, or a combination of both. Civilian vehicles, quite a few there being destroyed, and this is what's adding largely to the Ukrainian figures there. So well over half of the equipment being lost there, or certainly over half the equipment being lost there, is civilian equipment. So SUVs, pickups, so on and so forth. It shows that the Russians are hitting logistics lines. It could be that they're using these a lot up in Kursk as well, the Ukrainians, to get stuff from A to B more quickly. So a pickup's going to be better than a tracked vehicle, say in Kursk, to get supplies to a certain area. Anyway, the Russians, on the other hand, have lost a Buk M3 here, destroyed. It's an air defense system that's fairly valuable. I mean, it's not the best piece of air defense equipment, but it's still pretty valuable. Engineering vehicle on there as well, a couple of bits of artillery, a few tanks, a couple of tracked garden sheds, the old tanks with all that corrugated iron Mad Max style built around it. And also we have some infantry fighting vehicles, mainly destroyed, the IFVs and APCs. So it's good news for the Ukrainians there. That is older Soviet equipment, as you'd expect with the Russians, MTLBs as well. So usual kind of equipment, but with an air defense system thrown on, some trucks, civilian vehicles destroyed, and some ATVs as well. So yeah, as you would expect, numbers wise, you would want Russia to be losing way more than the Ukrainians. They are overall losing a few more, but it's not at the ratio of sort of 3-1 that we have seen previously, 5-1, sometimes 7-1, where you'd had really bad days on a front line where the Russians were attacking across region. The silver lining to the Ukrainians losing more than the Russians, or losing 1-1 to the Russians, or nearly that, is that it means that they have shifted the initiative in their direction, and they are the ones that are attacking. So on the one hand, you might say this is bad news, but on the other hand, it does reflect that the Ukrainians are taking the fight to the Russians, and that is kind of good news. You don't want to say it's good news that Ukrainians are losing more than they were, but actually, in a sense, it is good news. At the end of the day, you want the Ukrainians to wrest initiative from the Russians, to take territory back, to force the Russians to react, and you only do that by attacking. And when you attack, you lose more stuff than when you defend. It's as simple as that. Now, I've talked to you recently about how Andrew Perpetua, who, when he does these loss statistic lists, he is poring over phenomenal amounts of videos and imagery, him and his team. He is counting up the equipment, geolocating it, putting it on databases, etc. He's also started, for the last 11 days, counting up human losses, which is fairly macabre, but if you get past the darkness of it, statistically, and translating humans into numbers, it is statistically useful in the same way that counting equipment is, to try and get a handle on trends or accuracies and so on and so forth. What's interesting here is that, broadly speaking, it's been fairly consistent, about 65 people a day, 65 yesterday and 716 over the last 11 days. He then says it seems we'll be sitting on a throne of 23,000 skulls if this figure projects out a full year. Now, this is your benchmark minimum, right? This is not something you look to say, whether the Ukrainian figures that they claim are right or wrong. I think there's so much guesstimation involved in these figures, although there is a protocol and they do have to submit video evidence to their bosses or to their superiors, and they submit them to the general staff. And there is a protocol that's involved in here. These aren't numbers plucked out of their posteriors, apart from, as I keep saying, the personnel numbers will be far more guesstimation than the equipment numbers. When you look at an IFE that's blown up, that your drone has destroyed it and it's a smoking hulk, you say to your superiors, look what my unit's just done, it's blown this up, and they say, yep, that is verified, that is a blown up IFE, and you check that off on the ledger. When you take out a building, you're saying, we think there's 30 people in there, we've destroyed the building, we're guessing that we've seen 5 people run out, we're guessing that 25 people are dead or wounded. We don't know. They may have been evacuated later. They may not have been 30 in there. And there's a massive amount of guesstimation, right? And so I think these two types of these two categories of equipment and personnel are going to have very different metrics for accuracy, very different ways of calculating them, etc., etc. So when Andrew Perpetua does this, counting up on the videos of people he's definitely see die, that is a dead Russian soldier, check. That is 2 dead Russian soldiers, check. Okay, he is seeing 65 a day at the moment, massively down on 1,200, obviously, but you're never going to expect to see that on the socials. You're never going to expect to see 100% of the people killed on the front lines caught on camera. It's just not going to happen. You're far more likely to see 100% of infantry fighting vehicles caught on camera in a day than you are personnel. But it's an interesting benchmark minimum, rather like the Medusa or Mediazona, and BBC Russia project that I explained the other day. This is your benchmark minimum of deaths, and if that's 23,000 a year, then when the Russians come out and say this many people have died, and you're like, well, the benchmark minimum from visually confirmed losses is 23,000 for this year alone, then you are talking absolute nonsense, and the death figures are far, far worse than the Russians would be admitting. You could probably say the same for the Ukrainians as well. F-16 fighter jets have proved vulnerable to Russian air defense, while Ukrainian pilots lack experience, according to Wall Street Journal. Okay, so what happened yesterday, and I mentioned this I did a breaking news piece video on this. An F-16 was lost. It wasn't lost actually in combat, and that's why I'm not too sure about this Wall Street Journal claim. At least to how Nexter interpret it, being vulnerable to Russian air defense. I don't know that it is. All planes are vulnerable to air defense, right? I don't know that these are any more vulnerable. In fact, the idea is that they've got an upgraded electronic warfare system on that makes them supposedly invisible to Russian radars, etc., etc. Now, this plane lost, actually on Monday, was lost during the massive airstrike on Ukraine, and was not a combat loss. It was defending Ukraine and shooting down missiles. It did shoot, was it 3? What was so the Ukrainian Armed Forces officially confirmed the loss of an F-16 during Russia's recent massive missile attack on Ukraine. The fighter had gone missing during a mission to shoot down Russian cruise missiles and was later found crashed. The pilot was killed. There will be an inquiry into what's happened. It's Alexei Mez. I think he shot down 3 cruise missiles and a drone, something like that. Anyway, yeah, I don't know that this has anything to do with Russian air defense. It is a massive loss, but like I explained yesterday in the breaking news piece, the loss is in, I mean, obviously it's a human loss, so getting beyond that, it is a logistical loss and nothing more than that. I think we can be vulnerable to claiming a loss of an aircraft and a pilot is this huge thing, and it is like the airframe is just a hunk of metal, right, and components and parts. In other words, you just translate it into money. and there are plenty of F-16s around the world. So the loss of the airframe shouldn't be a worry because they should be able to get a bunch more into Ukraine. Now, the pilot is a problem past the human loss because it takes a long time to train these pilots. So that's where your bottleneck is. So when the Russians lose planes, and you say, right, that's a really good thing for the Ukrainians that they've lost the plane. I always talk about how the pilot is more important than the plane. The Russians have quite a lot of planes. And the difference with the Russians and the Ukrainians is that the Russians are unable to replace those planes as readily as the West is able to replace the Ukrainian planes. In principle, right? I'm not talking about the difficulty of people actually saying, okay, here's a plane and actually getting to Ukraine. But in principle, Russia is struggling with sanctions to build planes to the scale that they would need. And so when the Russians lose planes, then it's arguably more of an issue than the Ukrainians losing planes. And when they lose pilots, it's about the bottleneck in training and et cetera, et cetera. So when you compare, say, like a pilot as a single human being, you can recruit them. They're probably more readily recruitable, considering pilots are probably more survivable than being an infantryman on the front fighting in trenches, right? So you're probably going to get more people saying, yeah, I'll be a pilot than I'll be an infantryman. And it's just about the capacity of the Allies to train those pilots. So don't think this is like crazy bad. In fact, my opinion is they should be training a stupendous amount of pilots and getting as many jets as they can and just flying an absolute ton of F-16s and anything else they can get their hands on, because it's far more valuable than I don't know how I'd equate a single pilot to how many infantrymen, but what these planes can do is obviously, on a one-to-one basis from one pilot to one infantryman, you can achieve way more with one pilot than one infantryman, given the tools that an infantryman has compared to the tools a pilot has. And so need load more planes. You are going to lose planes. Don't worry about losing planes like to the point where you think this is the worst thing ever. This will happen as long as they can replace the plane and the pilot more easily than it probably looks like they can at the moment. Then it shouldn't be too much of a problem. The problem is the bottleneck. Okay, Kiev hopes that Western jets can provide an advantage on the battlefield, especially in protecting troops and intercepting missiles. However, many of the F-16s handing over are second-hand machines with years of service history, making them particularly vulnerable to Russian air defense systems and priority targets for Moscow, which I think is irrelevant given how there is a chance that this was shot down by its own air defenses, especially when you've got air defenses firing at the cruise missiles as well. There might well be this confusion of who is taking down that cruise missile. You've got the air defense going for it and the jet gets in the way, then the jet's going to take that interceptor maybe. Ukrainian pilots, although they have solid experience flying Soviet aircraft, are undergoing accelerated training of F-16s under normal circumstances. After completing the course, it takes several months of training flights before they can begin combat missions. The Wall Street Journal emphasizes that second point is more salient than the first. The first point is basically irrelevant because they're not at the moment flying in combat areas. So whatever. Now, it's interesting, and I saw this at the time and thought, I'm not too sure about that. And I'm really glad that John Richards has clarified this. So what you started seeing, because it came from the Wall Street Journal, and the headline was US-made F-16 crashed in Ukraine, killing pilot. So that's your headline. And I don't know whether they do that to appeal to the American audience. So you always want to make your headline and your story relevant to your readership, right? So this is why you always see if a local newspaper will take a national event and then skew it towards how it affects you locally so that it appeals to the reader, so the reader finds it more interesting and more relevant, right? And so you will have articles are always kind of skewed towards the demographics. In this case, it's an American newspaper, so they're not going to talk about Dutch-made F-16 or whatever, Belgian-made F-16 crashed in Ukraine, because that's like Americans be like, whatever, US-made F-16, okay. The thing is, it almost invariably was not a US-made F-16. So as John Rich said, all of Ukraine's F-16 midlife upgrades updates were locally manufactured in Europe. Airframe parts were produced in Norway, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, and the US. Airframe final assembly and checkout lines were in Belgium and the Netherlands, with an engine assembly line in Belgium. In other words, so he's absolutely right. Look at all these US-made F-16 crashed in Ukraine, says Wall Street Journal. CBS News picks that up, US-made F-16. New York Post, US-made F-16. I understand you might wanting to be appeal to your American audience, but that is technically inaccurate. So, or at least as far as I understand it. So, I don't like that. And then you start getting Americans reading that and going, what are our American planes getting, why they're being used by the Ukrainians, why they're getting blown up, and why are we giving them this plane that's, et cetera, et cetera. And you can get this kind of misreading of the situation that's kind of frustrating. Now, Adam Kinzinger, the former Republican lawmaker, says, when I met with Ukrainian pilots Juice and Moonfish, so Juice and Moonfish came to the US to try and lobby for F-16s, I had a sick feeling they wouldn't make it through the war. Juice died in August 2023, if you remember that, as quite a big deal. Moonfish died on Monday, so that was sad. Thank you very much, Ivan. They fought like hell for Ukraine and the F-16. Nickel on the grass, men. Slava Ukraini. Adam Kinzinger, still with the Ukrainian flag up there and Slava Ukraini in his handle title, is such a strong advocate for Ukraine. I've got a lot of time for Adam Kinzinger, to be perfectly frank. And it's interesting, Kamala Harris was talking about having a Republican on the cabinet. I don't know, it'd be Adam Kinzinger, but I wonder who they might consider if Harris gets in, and whether Adam Kinzinger might feature. But anyway, Max24 here says, as mentioned, soldiers of 46th Air Mobile Brigade there doing damage to an awful lot of Russian vehicles. 13 out of 17 that attacked were destroyed, which is an incredibly good kill ratio there. Okay, moving on to distance strikes, and now we've seen it, get back to normal. So we had 4 nights of, 3 of the previous 4 nights were huge drone attacks. One night was a massive missile attack, and that dropped to 10 missiles, and then it was like 2 or 3 missiles in the next few days. So I think we've seen that Russia do not have the capacity to fire massive missile strikes as often as they would like, but they do have a greater capacity in terms of manufacturing and procuring Shahed drones. So that they had 3 out of 4 nights, massive wave, and then last night they launched 18 drones at Ukraine. I think 12 were intercepted, 4 were lost due to electronic warfare, and that left 2 that hit their target. Or, I presume so. So that is, when we look at the interception rates, it's sometimes it's a bit inaccurate as to how successful we see the wave as being. And quite often, actually, more of them are taken out by electronic warfare, but they don't include them on these stats. These are interception rates only. So that's a fairly good night for the Ukrainians. 16 out of 18 of the drones were unsuccessful. However, 2 did get through. Russia, on the other hand, saying it destroyed 18 drones overnight. We don't know how many were actually sent. 11 were allegedly shot down over Bryansk region, 4 in Kaluga region, 2 over occupied Crimea, and just 1 in the Belgorod region. Now, I think Crimea, there were more sent over. There were more explosions in Crimea, and I think there were successful strikes on an airbase in Crimea. But anyway, we'll get to that. In fact, we'll get to that now. Going back to, this is underneath, I remember now. So 2 of Russia's attacks hit their targets, as I mentioned, in Sumy and in Poltava. In the latter, an industrial facility was hit by drones, no injuries reported. Meanwhile, in Sumy, 9 people have known to have been injured in Russia's strike. Infrastructure was also hit there, but probably significant that residents were advised to stay indoors and shut the windows. So there have been some strikes. 2 of those were successful, those drones. A video from Sumy, no other details, lots of smoke there, so don't know what was hit. But yeah, on to Russia's strike. So in Kaluga, so it says 4 were shot down, or the Russians say 4 were shot down in Kaluga, and actually there's videos of at least 2 of these getting shot down by either small arms fire or some kind of air defense. It sounds like small arms fire rather than interceptors. Now this was on the way to 2 of the 4 drones were near the airport, so there's an airport or airbase near there that appears to have been the target. And then Tim White was reporting last night, big news story could be happening right now. There are tentative reports of explosions in occupied Crimea. 4 blasts were heard over Kirovskoye, in the east of the peninsula. 3 somewhere near the airfield and 1 over the railway station in the town. Crimean Bridge stayed open. And then later, indeed this morning, Max 24 reports in Crimea, explosions rang out near Kirovskoye airfield and near Jankoy, which is a real logistics and military hub, airfield, etc., according to local residents. Kirovskoye, 3 explosions were heard near the airfield and 1 over the local railway station. Now, could those drones have been shot down? Might there have been no damage? Possibly, don't know. Then, going back to the strikes on Kaluga, this was, over Bryansk and then on to Kaluga, more likely, or could have been shot from Sumy over Kursk, Oriol, and on to Kaluga. But that's where that is. Drone attack on the airport and factory in Russia's Kaluga, says Euromaidan Press. Russian MOD reports engaging 18 unmanned aerial vehicles in multiple oblasts. And then that's that. So we don't have any more details, any evidence of success, but it is worth just looking at what Anton Gerashchenko says about the strikes on oil refineries and depots over the last 3 months. And this is in light of the fact that the Atlas oil depot in Rostov is still in flames 3 days after it was struck. And look at the fire that's happening there. Like, putting aside environmental catastrophe, this is an incredibly valuable strike on Russian hydrocarbons infrastructure, and not just there. So remember, the Proletarsk oil depot was struck. Now, although less than previous days, the Russian oil depot in Proletarsk has been burning for the 13th consecutive day, so it is still burning. Lots of burned out tanks are visible on satellite imagery, and as Maccaberry was saying, he has intimate knowledge of these and burning tanks in depots. He says that you will have metallurgical failure and issue with pretty much every tank there, even though the fire might, take those 4 up here in the top left hand corner. You might think, they're untouched, not a problem there, but actually there's every chance that there will be issues with that. You've got pipelines underneath, you've got all sorts of infrastructure that will be affected that might essentially render the entire depot useless, done for, even though not all the tanks will have been burned. Okay, we'll get on to that one in a second. So let's go back to Anton Gerashchenko. It says, he gives a summary of the last 3 months. So June the 2nd, fire in the reservoir tank storage of the oil refinery Ukhta in Komi Republic. June the 6th, attacks on oil refineries in Belgorod and Rostov. June the 20th, Platonovskaya oil depot in Tambov region on fire. June the 20th, same day, fire broke out at Lukoil Yugneftprodukt oil refinery in the village of NM in Krasnodar Krai. June the 21st, Ukrainian armed forces attacked Afipsky, Ilsky, Krasnodar Neft and Astrakhan refineries with drones, all of those in one night. July the 13th, attack on oil depot in Rostov region. Tuapse, 22nd of July. 27th, Ryazan. August the 1st, Omsk. August the 18th, Kavkaz, and that was a pretty big one near the town of Proletarsk, Rostov. That's the 11th day. Actually, that's 13th day now. August the 28th, Atlas oil depot in the Rostov region and the Zenit oil depot in the Kirov region were hit. So you add all of that up and it becomes apparent. And then that's not to talk about all the previous refineries and oil. I mean, most of these are actually oil depots as opposed to refineries. But you remember all those previous sort of refinery and depot attacks over the 2 years prior to that, or certainly 6 months prior to that. And you start adding up all of these and thinking, man, the Russians are going to be in a spot of bother concerning all of their infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And in fact, then when you hear that the employees of the Moscow Ministry of Emergency Situations are being transferred to an enhanced duty regime for the next few weeks, you're thinking they are properly worried about strikes now into Moscow. If you go back to watch my live, or if you've seen my live stream yesterday with Daniela from Tochny, he talks about there being the electrode style forging industrial plant in Moscow area, and you're thinking that has got to be up the top of the target list. You're going to have surely other infrastructure around Moscow. They are worried. They are looking around and seeing that the Ukrainians are able to fairly easily strike and cause massive damage to all sorts of infrastructure within Russia. This war has now come to Russia, and the Russians are actually reacting to that in a way that shows that they are genuinely worried. Meanwhile, on September the 2nd in Moscow, for, quote, security reasons, they want to move school assemblies from the streets to indoors. So school meetings aren't going to be taking place outdoors anymore. My goodness, they are genuinely worried about Ukrainian strikes, and for good reason, right? Okay, moving on to other bits and pieces now. Former Deputy Defense Minister Pavel Popov has been detained in Russia for fraud on a particularly large scale, says Nexter. Former Deputy Defense Minister Popov detained, and he was dismissed from his post 2 months ago. He worked as Deputy Defense Minister for 11 years and supervised a system of Russian defense control centers. The case against him is related to the activities of Patriot Park, investigators said. He's accused of fraud in the construction and maintenance of the park. Popov worked with Shoigu for a long time. Since 1996, he worked in senior positions in the Russian Emergencies Ministry, and from 2008 to 2013 was deputy head of the Emergencies Ministry. So we have seen what looks rather like a purge of some of the old school military hierarchy, possibly. And you know, part of that purge was seeing also Shoigu move sideways. We've seen a kind of a relegation of Gerasimov. He's supposed to be the commander-in-chief, yet any footage of him is either exceptionally dodgy, such as that one we recently saw that looked like it was old footage and stuff was blurred out so you couldn't tell it was new, and the audio was completely muted. And supposedly Gerasimov talking to Putin about Kursk, but the telephones looked really old, and there was hand sanitizer, which makes you think it was probably back in the days nearer to the pandemic. I don't know. You know, everything about Gerasimov is dodgy, and he seems to be sidelined in the Kursk operation. So the defense of Kursk was put onto the FSB guy, and then he was moved aside and someone else. So you're wondering if there's just this big clearing of the Russian military hierarchy. And yeah, again, when you see any data points like this, the question is, does this support the hypothesis that everything's going well for the Russians, or does this support the hypothesis that it's all a bit of a disaster, or anyway in particular? You know, what does this data better support? And then you've got Dmitry Medvedev. So, oh my goodness, so former premier in Russia, sharing an elaborate post, which apparently took him a week to craft, where he lays out the reasons behind Russia's ruthless tactics in seizing Donbass, even if it means leveling cities and sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives, says Dmitry from War Translated. According to him, Donbass holds mineral resources valued at $7.3 trillion, a sum that, in Putin's eyes, justifies the loss of a few 100,000 Russian lives, multiplied by 5 million rubles of payments per corpse. That's still nothing. For the past decade, the Russian people have been laboring under the Kremlin's control, eager to exploit this valuable resource. Meanwhile, Ukrainians continue to fight valiantly, refusing to surrender their land to the murderous thieves and plunderers. So this is a long and I guess somewhat detailed explanation of why, and it's just pure projection of why the West is interested in Ukraine, because of all the natural resources that are under its under the ground, or indeed in some places under the sea. And he's then, you know, blaming the West for, you know, instead of UN expansionism, this is now natural resource thievery. Of course, since it was Russia that invaded in 2014, and they're the ones that have been doing the invading properly, then actually this is just pure projection, and this is what Russia is indeed interested in, and that's why they have been going literally invading the Donbass. It's only Russia that are invading Donbass, not the US. They haven't invaded Donbass. And Ukraine went to the UN and want to join. Sorry, not the UN. NATO. I was talking about NATO expansionism. It was Ukraine that went to NATO. NATO haven't accepted Ukraine, remember? It is Ukraine that have gone towards the EU and want to join the EU. Yes, the EU will welcome them in, but they have to jump through a bunch of hoops. This is a case of Ukraine's agency, not those other entities stealing Ukraine from under the sphere of influence of Russia. Russia themselves are the expansionist ones. They're the ones who have invaded to expand their own empire. They are the ones that seem far more explicitly interested in the natural resources of Ukraine. Anyway, now General Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, has admitted that fighting near Pokrovsk is exceptionally brutal. Now, I don't quite know what to think about Pokrovsk. There is something in what the Russians themselves are saying, which is slightly wary about this, because if the Ukrainians really do have several reserve units that are able to be committed to Pokrovsk but aren't being committed, what's going on there? And we talk about Pokrovsk getting pretty hairy at the moment, and it's all fairly terrible. And yet there's only been a limited set of forces committed by Ukraine to that area. And you're wondering, is there something else going on? I'm not talking about, the Ukrainians committing to another offensive elsewhere. I don't think that's remotely plausible. Could it be luring them in to then try and cut them off? Like, what is going on? I don't know. But it certainly is odd that it is exceptionally brutal down there, and yet the response has been somewhat limited. Now, Terets, sadly, just north of the Pokrovsk region, is looking more and more like Bakhmut, and Bakhmut looked like Severodonetsk, and Severodonetsk looked like Popasna, and everywhere that Russia goes, Mariinka, Novomykhailivka, Krasnohorivka, like all of these places are liberated by leveling. Is that really what freedom looks like? Is that really what liberation looks like? Well, this is now what is happening to Toretsk, and it's desperately sad. Now, Defmon has a good point here. His data suggests that the Russian rate of advance has doubled since the start of the Kursk invasion. So the idea that the Kursk invasion was going to stop the Russian advances in Pokrovsk, if that was one of the objectives, that has failed. But what it has done is it's stopped all these advances in many other places on the front line. So the Russians have taken troops from the front line, just not from Pokrovsk, because they realise that Pokrovsk is where they have been succeeding the most. And in fact, what they've done is actually doubled down on Pokrovsk, throwing even more troops in. Everyone, I was going to say everyone and their mother, but they've thrown everything in the kitchen sink at Pokrovsk. And the data suggests that since the Kursk incursion, actually that rate of territorial gain in the Pokrovsk region has accelerated, doubled even, and that says something. That's slightly worrying for the Ukrainians, to say the least. Now, no report says of the Kursk area that less fighting is reported from both sides. Basically, momentum has passed, and this is, although that sounds like bad news, this is always going to happen. Like the Ukrainians were never going to carry on advancing at the pace they were forever, and it would spread themselves too thin anyway. At some point, it would have to slow down and grind to a halt, and then the Russians are going to start digging and defending properly. Well, this is now happening. Less fighting is reported from both sides. That doesn't mean nothing is happening, but Ukraine is also digging in and preparing for a longer stay. So the question is now, what do the Ukrainians do? Okay, you've taken what you can take. They might well be still looking at taking all the areas south of the same river. That seems eminently plausible and sensible. They might be trying to take Koronovo still and a couple of other areas, but they're generally sort of settling down, starting to dig in. There's evidence they are using excavators to dig some trenches there. So it could be that it is the momentum has shifted. They're slowing down. They kind of culminated effectively. And again, that's not a bad thing. That was always going to happen. The question is where were they going to be when it happened? And they actually took more land initially than probably they were expecting. And it's been very successful in those terms. Where now? That's a question. Okay, according to Donbass Reali correspondent Yegor Loginov, the situation in Sudzha, so that is to the right-hand side, that's Sudzha there on the map. Sorry, make it a little bit bigger for you. Sudzha is over here. That's that area. In fact, there it is. Anyway, the situation in Sudzha has become much more dangerous compared to a week ago. Russian forces are regularly shelling the city and surrounding areas with guided bombs, cabs, and artillery. So the Russian artillery is in force, and the guided glide bombs released by aviation are being used far more, which wasn't the case at the beginning of the Kursk offensive, because the Ukrainians had some man pads active. The Russians were a little bit afraid to use close air support, but with those guided glide bombs, now that they know what targets they're going for, it's not so dynamic. Things are settled down. They can hit the Ukrainian positions more. The Ukrainian positions are more secure, and so it's easier for the Russians to hit them with those, and they can release them 70 kilometers, 50 kilometers, whatever it is, behind the contact line, so they are safe from man pads. They would only be hit by longer range air defense systems, which won't have been moved into Kursk. Like a Patriot system isn't going to be moved into Kursk. So you're going to see a lot more aviation being used and artillery, and that means that it's getting into a positional stage. Russian authorities form armed volunteer security units in Kursk amid Ukraine's incursion. Again, what does this data tell you? Is this a sign of some of a military that's very well prepared and they have enough troops to defend the area? Members of the volunteer detachment will receive training and weapons in order to maintain law and order as Ukrainian troops continue to advance. And finally, as I mentioned yesterday, Russian paramilitaries, about 100 men from the Bear Brigade, are leaving Burkina Faso, according to Le Monde. So these guys are offering security, providing security in countries in Africa like Burkina Faso. There was recently a massive massacre of some 300 people by ISIS in the area, and I don't know if this is coinciding with that. But they are pulling out of Burkina Faso supposedly to actually come and help back in Kursk, which shows how desperate things are in Kursk. So yes, the momentum has shifted. The Russians are beginning to be able to defend more appropriately the area, but they are having to pull people from all over the shop. But interesting, they'd rather pull people from Burkina Faso than from Pokrovsk. And then finally, according to War Translated, Russians' discontent with the authorities has reached the highest point since the 2022 mobilization. So this is, yes, it's data from Russian surveys, but although it's never going to be totally accurate, there is going to be some element of truth to it. Amid the ongoing fighting in Kursk region, 28% of Russians expressed outrage or dissatisfaction, so this is bottom line, with the government's actions over the past month. So remember, I've often talked about how a quarter of the population really don't like the war, quarter of the population is well up for the war, and 50% in the middle are kind of apathetic, will go along with whatever. And I guess there's an element of this being reflected here, but it's whether that quarter at the bottom grows to more than a quarter. According to the data from the Public Opinion Foundation, 28% of Russians express outrage or dissatisfaction with the government's actions over the past month. This marks the highest level of discontent in nearly 2 years, with a previous peak of 30% recorded on November the 6th, 2022, shortly after the mobilization was announced. And that's why they didn't want to mobilize again, haven't wanted to, because 30% of people, which you can imagine is your benchmark minimum, is probably going to be something like 40 something, or I don't know, I'm sort of making it up, but it's going to be more than 30%. Were not happy shortly after the mobilization was announced. So since then, dissatisfaction has not reached 28%. So Kursk is having an effect on Russian public opinion. That much is certain. Anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate your support. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.